The following interview with Dr. Clarence D. Parks, DVM, was conducted in the fall of 2006 with his daughter Sylvia Schaefer at his side. I've also received some help from Linda Baldwin of Baldwin Farms, a good friend of Dr. Parks that, with his blessing, has become the caretaker of the Dyberry prefix. Taking on a profile like this is daunting, as it's impossible to list all of Dr. Parks' contributions and accomplishments. I'll do the best I can to reflect the passion he has for the Morgan breed and to let him tell his story in his own words. Throughout the profile, I'll include portions of a story written by Dr. Parks and his wife Martha, as well as quotes from his publication, The History, Standard of Perfection, and Judging Outline for the Morgan Horse, which was published in July of 1952. It was in that booklet that he wrote, "No other type is so well adapted to the need of the pleasure horse owner as the Morgan. His beauty, strength, endurance, durability, and mental adaptability are not equaled by any other breed." Please join me in thanking Dr. Parks for his commitment to the Morgan breed for what is now over 70 years. And now for our profile. C.D. Parks was born April 5, 1911, in Susquehanna, Pennsylvania. When asked for his earliest memory of a horse, he shares the story of his grandfather's work horses and how one would nicker when he pointed his finger at him. It wasn't long after that as a youth Clarence brought home his first horse, and you can hear the story of "the only horse I ever made any money on" here.
I can't remember the name of the horse, but he came from Peter's farm. My grandfather bought a pair of horses sired by him when they were 2 and 3 years old, and he trained them and used them on the farm. And when they were getting ice off the river, one of them got colic and died. That was the mare. The gelding lived to be about 30 years old, and I remember it when I was about 5 years old. I would go down to the barn and point my finger at him and he would squeal, and I had a lot of fun with him. But they put him down when he was about 30 years old. And they were both grays of a gray standardbred mare. My first horse I skipped school and bought for $10. It was a pony with stiff ankles. When I brought it home, my grandfather shook his head and walked away. But it was not lame. It had stiff ankles in front, and I sold it for $30 to a friend of mine. And I bought the standardbred mare for $30. She was 11 years old and never trained, never broke. And I bought her, and she was about 15 miles from home, and I rode her home, and she was as crazy as a horse can be. I got into Windsor and stopped at the blacksmith shop and had him cut the chain off the curb bit. And when I got her home, my grandfather shook his head again. He was an excellent horseman, my grandfather was. And she hadn't been trained to drive. And I took her up in the field and tied her to the gate post, put a harness and cart on her, and quick turned her loose and jumped in the cart. And we went around the field a few times. And I drove her into the barn and tied her and unhitched her. And that's the way I drove her. I'd hitch her in the barn, open the door, and jump in, and away we'd go. And this was when I was in high school. And when I graduated, I went to veterinary school. And the first fall I was in school, the mare was turned out in the pasture, and somebody left the gate open during hunting season, and she got out in the road and got hit by a car, broke her leg, and they destroyed her. And the insurance company of the car paid me $100 for it. And that's the most money I ever made on a horse.
Dr. Parks graduated in 1933 with a degree in veterinary medicine from the University of Pennsylvania Veterinary School. Parks' notes read, "My interest in the Morgan horse had been aroused when, as a veterinary student in 1932, I spent the summer as an intern with Dr. J.V. Stoll of Rome, Pennsylvania. When Dr. Stoll was discharged from the Army Cavalry in 1918, following the First World War, he returned home to Rome to begin his large animal practice. Automobiles were not yet the transportation of choice in winter, and Dr. Stoll purchased a Morgan horse from Reverend Frisbee in Wysocks, Pennsylvania, to use in his practice. He was so pleased with the performance of this horse that he eventually acquired 6 Morgan horses from Reverend Frisbee. 2 of them, Jesse Reno and Wysocks, were stallions. Dr. Stoll's practice grew rapidly, and eventually he drove 2 pairs alternating half days. His stableman would meet him with a fresh pair and a supply of drugs as needed. He would continue on his rounds, sometimes into the next day, with a second pair. There were occasions when Dr. Stoll would spend the night where his last call was made. Dr. Stoll discontinued driving horses about 1928 or 1929. When I was with him in 1932, he showed me the last of his horses, an aged gelding, still hale and hearty. The stallion, Wysocks, he had given to an uncle who drove him to the village for his weekly shopping trip. Those 2 horses and the tales Dr. Stoll related about their accomplishments created in one what became a lifelong interest in Morgan horses. During his time as an apprentice veterinarian, Dr. Parks met Martha Shotwell. Martha was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and graduated from Marathon Central School in Marathon, New York in 1930. She then went on to nursing school in Cortland County to graduate in 1933, and they were married in 1934. Here Dr. Parks talks about meeting Martha.
Martha was in nurses training in Cortland, New York, and she came down to visit her sister, her friend Madeline, who lived in town. And Doc Stoll had another fellow working for him, and we went to a dance on Friday night. And Martha and her friend Madeline were at the dance. And I talked to my buddy and I said, "So you get a dance with Madeline and you find out about this friend of hers and get the scoop and bring it back to me." And he did that. So I had all the dope. So I asked her for a dance, and she gave me all kinds of information, which wasn't the same as I had from my friend. I sorted it out after a while. I used to go to Cortland to see her occasionally. And when I was in college, I used to donate blood. And at that time, we got $40 a pint for donated blood at the university. And I saved up my money, sent her tickets. She used to come down to the university for a weekend when she had time off. And we went to the Ivy Ball in 1933 after I graduated. And at that time, my roommate, Jim Tuss, he was an Irishman who came over from Ireland, and his father had come over and established a practice in New Jersey. He and I were roommates, and Martha brought her friend from Cortland down, and we went to the Ivy Ball. And before the Ivy Ball, we went down to the Methodist church where I was going to church when I was in school, and the minister married us that night before the Ivy Ball. Of course, we had no place to live. We got married and we moved into Homestead in an apartment for $30 a month with lights and heat. The twins were born while we lived there in the Homestead apartment, and we lived there for 2 years, I believe. And at that time, I bought a lot and we built a house, and we moved in that in 1937. Well, a friend of mine and I went to Vermont to look at horses, and we visited several farms and finally got to the Lippert farm. And they had 31 horses there at that time, and they had only accommodations for 29. So they had 2 that they wanted to sell. And I picked out 2 mares that I liked, but they were not for sale. And the horses that were for sale were Lippert Miss Nokomia and I can't, Lippert Rose Ash, and I can't remember the other one's name, but I picked out Lippert Miss Nokomia as my choice. And my friend picked out Rose Ash, and they wanted $200 a piece for these horses. And we talked about buying the 2, and we offered them $200 for the pair. And the caretaker called Mr. Knight and asked and told him that we had offered $200 for the pair, and he said to sell them. So we bought the pair for $200, and they were in Vermont, and we had no way to get them home. But he had a pickup truck, and he put sideboards on the pickup truck and went up there and loaded the 2 horses and brought him home in an open pickup truck. And that's when we started our Morgan breeding program. Well, we didn't even have a barn. We kept her in a neighbor's barn until we built a barn for ourselves. And that was about 6 months later. We bred her when she was 3 years old. I had, now Dr. Stahl that I worked for graduated in 1916 when he got out of the Army. He bought a Morgan horse from Dr. Frisbee in Towanda. And the horse worked out so well for him that he went back and bought another. And eventually he had 5 registered Morgan horses that he drove in his practice. He drove a pair in his practice, and he had a man working for him at the stable, and he would drive a pair until noon and call him and have him meet him someplace with more drugs, and he traded horses there. And sometimes he would not even go home at night. He would stay where his last call was. He had a terrific practice immediately in Bradford County. And the last horse he had, when he sold his horses, he gave to his uncle, and that horse was Wysox, named after the village. And he was found, the owner was found dead in the manger of this horse, and he thought maybe the horse killed him. He didn't know he was a bad acting horse. And the horse went to Towanda, and I heard that he was for sale, and I went and bought him for $50. And he was in bad shape. And I kept him for about 2 years. And in the meantime, I was in the hospital with a bad back, and a client of mine had been using him as a part of his team. Well, a horse was laid up, and while I could no longer use him, he was destroyed and buried down in the fairground flat in front of our house. And from that pair of horses, the stud and the mare, we raised 2 horses. Yep. The first one in 69 and 39, and the second one was born in 40. Mm-hmm.
Another of Dr. Park's interest is his study of Morgan pedigrees. Starting very early on, Dr. Parks undertook a study of the Morgan registry and would map out for any given Morgan the percentage of Justin Morgan blood. If you listen to this clip of Dr. Parks talking, he'll share how he got started doing this. It's of significance to note that he continues to do this to this very day.
When I was in high school, I injured my back, and I had back problems, And in 1939, I think it was, I went to Philadelphia. And they put me in a body cast from my knees to my shoulders. And I was in that for 2 months. And when they took me out of the body cast, they put me in a body brace. And I wore that body brace for 10 years. And it was from my hips to my shoulders. And I practiced with that body brace. And eventually I was beginning to get problems in my legs. So I went back to the university, or back to the hospital, and they did an operation on me and took 3 discs out of my back and screwed the vertebrae together and sent me home. And I now have 3 lumbar vertebrae fused with 6 screws holding it together.
And that was since 40.
And
I've never had any
I
problem.
have been in good shape ever since. And there were several, I think 3 or 4 fellows from Honesdale had that same operation, but none of them turned out as well as mine. In fact, there are 2 or 3 of them still alive. And every time they x-ray me for something, and I find these screws in my back, they are a little astonished.
So you were, it was during that time that you started to do the pedigrees?
Oh, when I was in the body cast, Marty went down to the butcher shop and got a sheet of butcher paper and put it on the wall, and she did the first pedigree of Wysox on the wall. I think it's still around someplace, but I don't know where it is. And that's when I got interested in the Morgan pedigrees.
It's exciting to hear Dr. Parks talk about the fascinating people that he's crossed paths with. Before continuing our story of Comia and the Parks family, I'd like to share some of Dr. Parks' observations on Robert Knight and the Green Mountain Stock Farm in Vermont, home of the Lippet Morgans. Before joining Dr. Parks, I'd like to read the following, which was published in the Complete Dispersal of Lippet Morgan Sales Catalog, and this was for the Lippet sale September 24th, 1962. And it reads, in 1927, after the death of A. Fullerton Phillips, Windsor, Vermont, a band of Morgans were purchased by Mr. Knight. Included in the purchase were the stallions Ashbrook and Morrow, the mares Nicomia, Adeline Bundy, and Green Mountain Twilight. Other outstanding mares, including Trilby, Trixie, and Mary Allen, were added to the Lippet band. From his experience in breeding Ayrshires, Mr. Knight knew that the outstanding individuals were consistently reproduced by strong breeding families, and consequently he built his Morgans on the same breeding principles.
The Knight family owned Fruit of the Loom.
Didn't know that. All right.
And he was a millionaire. And he said, I'm awful glad that my father had money so I don't have to work. He had Ayrshire cattle, and that was an Ayrshire cattle farm where the Green Mountain horse farm was originally an Ayrshire farm. And he used to show Ayrshire cattle all over the country. And I have to tell you how he came by the Lippets. A. Fullerton Phillips scoured the country and spent a fortune seeking out the best Morgan horses in the early 1900s. And when he died, he left a half a dozen horses, and the feed man that furnished feed at this farm also furnished feed to Knight's farm. And when this man, Fullerton Phillips, died, the feed man said to Knight, "You should buy these horses." And on his way back to Rhode Island, he stopped and he bought the horses. And that started the Lippett farm. He named, his mother's maiden name was Lippett. That's how come. Then he bought, beside those foundations, he bought the 2 studs and 2 or 3 mares. It was Morrow and Ashbrook.
Continuing our story, Dr. Parks writes, Lippett Miss Nicomia produced 7 colts and 7 fillies. She died about 2 weeks before she was due with her 15th foal. She won the 100-mile trail ride in Woodstock, Vermont in 1942. She placed second in the same ride in 1944 and third in 1946. She raised a foal each year during her 6 years of competition. In 1947, she was the grand champion mare at the then designated National Morgan Show held in Windsor, Vermont. Her foal, Dyberry Billy, won the foal class, and together they won the Marin foal class. Lippett Miss Nicomia was, without doubt, one of the outstanding horses of the breed, and of course she was the favorite of our breeding program. Comia, as they called her, was 14.2 hands and in working condition 1,060 pounds. Here Dr. Parks and daughter Sylvia talk about this mare and her accomplishments and how he first learned of the Green Mountain Horse Association 100-mile trail ride.
Well, she was a beautiful mare. But the pictures we have from her are when she was nursing a foal, and they never look real well when they're nursing foals. She was a very nice mare to handle, very quiet, but when she was in action, she was tough. She was really tough. And I was not a real experienced horseman when I broke her and I spoiled her. I spoiled her mouth. We usually rode her in a hackamore. But she would go as long as you would stay with her. She never quit.
I never knew what heart meant until we rode her in those 100-mile trail rides, and she would just go and go and go and go, and she probably would have dropped dead if you kept her going.
Well, she won the 100-mile in 1942. I rode her in 1941. I trained a stud for the ride, and he went lame. And the mare had been going with him in training, so we took the mare instead of the stud to the 100-mile. And that was her first 100-mile. And it's a wonder I didn't kill her, because she was not in shape for it, really. She lived in Honesdale at the time. And I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and ride her 10 miles, come back in and get breakfast, and get on the road in the practice. And in the afternoon, Martha would ride her another 10 miles or whatever, And that's the way we trained her for the 100 mile. I won in 1942. Martha rode her in 1943. She got a second. And in 1944, I rode her, got a third. Well, when we were in Vermont, when we bought the mare, I was at the Townsend Morgan Horse Farm, and Anna Ela had just returned from riding in the 100 mile. And that's where I got to know about the 100 mile and got interested in doing it. I was smoking a pipe at that time. The old Laconia was really hot in the 100 mile. And I had to ride her about 10 miles before I could get my pipe lit. She made the 100 mile ride 5 years in succession and raised a colt each year.
Dr. Parks goes on to write, our objective at that time was the production of long-distance competitive horses as well as maintaining the type. You'll notice that in breeding Lippet Mysticomia, Dr. Parks had used the stallion Archie O. Archie O was owned by C.J. O'Neill, and to better understand this man, we've included an excerpt from an article written by Marilyn C. Childs titled The O'Neills, 5 Decades of Morgan Interest, as originally published in the July 1979 issue of the Morgan Horse magazine, and this is quoted with the permission of the author. It was Charlie O'Neill who traveled countless miles over the United States, Canada, and Mexico, promoting the Morgan horse in the late 30s and 40s. At that time, the breed was struggling to make a comeback from its near extinction following the advent of the automobile. It was Charlie O'Neill who preached the old type Morgan, and it was Charlie who conceived the idea of a gold band Morgan club for horses with no known outside blood. Although the Gold Band organization was never inaugurated, Charlie's effort focused attention on the need to preserve the old type Morgan. It gave impetus to the formation of the Lippet Club, which today seeks to keep the old original blood intact. Archie O was promoted by C.J. O'Neill as the Morgan type elite in his efforts to revive the breed in the 40s and was Charlie O'Neill's famous traveling stallion. Dr. Parks and C.J. shared their concern about a movement away from Morgan type and visited the United States government farm where they were breeding what both felt were less than desirable Morgan type. Here we've included Dr. Parks' commentary about that visit.
Well, to me, Justin Morgan was the Morgan type, and his offspring were very much like him. That established the Morgan type, his immediate offspring. And the type was very consistent for about 3 or 4 generations. And then, if it wasn't inbred, it disappeared. But a few farmers in Vermont inbred these immediate offspring of Justin Morgan, and that established the Morgan breed. The foundation mares at the government farm were not good Morgan type. They were a mixed group of mares with very little Morgan blood. And the stallion they started with was not very great. And they line bred these horses and they lost the Morgan type. The mares were not good Morgan type. Charlie O'Neill and I went to the government farm, and tried to talk to them into improving the breeding of the government horses. And the owner said that they had their own breeding program and they were not going to change. So Charlie O'Neill was a Morgan breeder in Illinois, and he says, we will close the government farm down if they're not going to change, because they were not doing a good job with the Morgan horses at that time. So he got an appointment, an interview with his congressman in Washington. And so Charlie O'Neill and Peter Hunt in New Jersey and I went to Washington and met with the group that had charge of the government farm. The spokesman for the group that we met with asked Charlie what his problem was, and he says, Parks will tell you. And that's the first I knew that I was supposed to be the talker for this group